So welcome to the last in our series of webinars on the topic of who is the Buddha. Today's session is going to explore the Buddha in modern Britain. And of course, the Buddha is a very familiar part of British society, from garden ornaments to Buddhist monasteries, via museum holdings and so on, and even actually in the form of stupas, as we'll find out a bit later in the session. So what does the Buddha mean in Britain today? So although quite a lot of what we're going to cover today is going to be about Buddhists in Britain, and indeed Buddhism in Britain, the series is very much focused on the Buddha, and we're still going to use him, that is to say his image, his associations, perceptions of his authority, attempts to reach back to what he really meant as a focal point for today's talk. And we're going to give you a little bit of potted history of how Buddhist imagery and ideas and practices arrived in the UK, but we'll be mostly looking at what the Buddha means today for British people, both Buddhist and not, and of course for those who are somewhere in between.
Okay, and we'll start with this somewhere in between, and with a little reflection on the difficulties of clearly demarcating this or that religion, for us of course Buddhism, visible in a society like that of the UK. It's obvious enough that we're today in the 21st century surrounded by the language and iconography of Buddhism. And one could just visit a local supermarket, or still more likely a vendor of household or garden ornaments. You see a slide here with some of these things, to encounter images of the Buddha. One can buy Buddha branded clothing, stationery, food and drink, including maybe somewhat perversely beer that might be served in a Buddhist themed bar, and remembering that ancient Buddhism takes a hard line against intoxicants. Now in the present slide here are some photos that I took just yesterday at a local branch of a well-known home and garden goods store. And as I wandered around the shop, I eventually gave up counting after I counted about 40 separate Buddhas or Bodhisattvas around the shop. And it's not a massive shop, I should add. And there were definitely over 30 different designs available. And I should add that not everything in this slide is a Buddha, as by now you might be able to recognize. Not necessarily claiming that every consumer necessarily knows this. So bottom left, for example, is something that's in fact based on an image of Maitreya, that is the Bodhisattva who will be the next Buddha. And then bottom right, different again, are these smiling, infantile looking figures. And these are probably based on a popular Japanese depiction of another Bodhisattva called Jizo. The bold figure, one from the right, is also clearly based on Jizo, although looking a bit more austere. But are these images that we see of Buddhas or of Bodhisattvas, we can see them all around us, are they what we might call Buddhist images? By this I mean, do they play a part in the living practice of what we might call Buddhism in Britain today? In the modern consumerist use of Buddhist imagery, also of course in print, in music, television, or in other media, is this evidence of the presence or prevalence of Buddhism, strictly speaking? Now, the obvious answer is that this kind of stuff isn't indicative of people being Buddhist or doing things Buddhist per se, but maybe we shouldn't be quite so hasty. In the 2011 UK census, there were roughly 178,000 people who declared themselves Buddhist. Many of these people come from Asian Buddhist cultures, so they might represent diasporic Buddhist communities from South, Southeast, Central or East Asia. But then there are also members of what we might call homegrown Western Buddhist traditions, such as the Tri-ratna order, which Naomi will go on to speak about a little later on. However, there are also a great many more people in the UK who do not identify as Buddhist, as opposed to any other competing religious identity or affiliation, but whom we might want to call something like Buddhist sympathizers. Scholars, including Thomas Tweed, have used this term to designate people who may not want to tick a box on a form identifying themselves as, in this case, Buddhist, but who, for example, could partake in meditation retreats that might be run by Buddhist institutions. Or these people might subscribe to publications by confessional Buddhist organizations. And importantly, this hypothetical Buddhist sympathizer is not a lapsed or lazy Buddhist. They would actively not self-identify as Buddhist. and perhaps might instead tick a box declaring themselves to be Christian, Jewish, or otherwise. But they nonetheless engage with Buddhist-oriented ideas, literature, art, and practices with some personal investment in what all of this signifies. Some of these people might instead consider themselves spiritual, but again, not want to explicitly call themselves Buddhist. The British fascination with things Buddhist in something like this manner is not new. And in material terms, it's hard to say whether or not we're even at its peak. And this undoubtedly dates back at least to the 19th century and the British accessibility to Buddhist ideas and culture that was afforded by empire. And to be clear, British control of India didn't play a major part in this picture. It's worth remembering that although we often talk about Buddhism as an Indian phenomenon, and it was part of the religious and political scene in India for 2000 years, Buddhism had essentially disappeared from India by the time Europeans engaged seriously with the peoples and cultures there. What they found were ruins and remnants of Buddhism that were preserved predominantly by the Hindu population. But wider European colonialism, including British control of Sri Lanka and Burma, provided access to especially Theravadan Buddhist ideas and culture. In the 19th century, there was the still prevailing notion that Buddhism was described as a heathen or idolatrous thing, with little sense of its historical spread. That is, in the early 19th century. It was seen to be a disparate or even threatening thing that was an obstacle or even opponent to Christian missionaries working overseas. But later on in the 19th century, the mood in the UK and elsewhere in the West somewhat changed. This discomfort with a perceived religious other was replaced by a fascination with what was sometimes romanticized as some mysterious treasure from the mystic East, or Buddhism was embraced as a tradition that was somehow very rational. At its heart, something maybe even more progressive or scientific than the Christianity with which most people in Britain were more accustomed. As I think we mentioned earlier, the fact that we refer to the Buddha as enlightened is in fact a product of Western scholarship on Buddhism in its infancy. This scholarship trying to find a word to describe the Buddha's achievement. This choice of language, him as enlightened, implies a comparison between the Buddha and the Western Enlightenment, very specifically. The range of lenses through which Buddhism was inspected by Western scholars, authors, and artists is very diverse. And as I run through a few examples, dating back over 100 years, I'll invite you to think about how these different readings of the Buddha and of Buddhism relate to what you might know of perception about Buddhism in the UK today. And remember also that in the notes accompanying these slides, we're recommending some further reading about the things that I'm discussing. I'm of course just talking about things in brief here. So on the one hand, in the 19th century, there was the scholarly endeavor to make sense of Buddhism and its literature. And in the late 1800s, this privileged the Pali Canon, which we've referred to a few times. So this was, in the eyes of many academics in the field, considered the Buddhist canon, the Buddhist literature that was most worthy of study. And the foundation in 1881 of the Pali Text Society, which is still to this day dedicated to fostering and promoting the study of Pali texts, was a watershed in the early academic study of Buddhism. And on the left in the slide is an image of the complete edition of the Pali Canon by the Pali Text Society. And producing this was no small feat, and it remains the form of the canon that is still most used by scholars the world over today. But this focus on the Pali Canon had some other interesting effects in the world beyond just scholarship. In the 19th century, this way of studying Buddhism was informed by what we could say was a Protestant presumption that it was in grappling directly with scripture that one comes to know the real essence of a religious tradition. And this apart from and in contrast to whatever else one might see in the world, the text is really the thing. And this way of thinking about Buddhism led to the emergence in the Buddhist world, initially in Sri Lanka, of what is sometimes called Protestant Buddhism. And this is a trend in the Theravada tradition that is defined by thinking about the Pali Canon in this way. That is, prioritizing the text and a certain interpretation of the text over and above all kinds of other things, including lots of other very traditional and ancient practices. So here we find evidence of a kind of feedback from scholarship into the lived practice of a tradition. And all of this takes us further away from Buddhism in Britain. But Protestant Buddhism is another interesting thing that one might explore. And then again, we've got early British artistic encounters with Buddhism. And particularly noteworthy here is Sir Edwin Arnold, who in 1879 published The Light of Asia. Now, this is a work that we mentioned very briefly already in the first session. The Light of Asia is a narrative poem. It's in the style of a great many more famous British works, and it retells the story of Siddhartha Gautama's early life, his renunciation and teaching. And it's both an early work that incorporates a wide range of Buddhist ideas and terminology and presents all this to a popular English reading audience, but it's also very obviously infused with the language of Arnold's Anglican heritage. And in this slide, you'll find a link, in the notes to the slide, you'll find a link to a complete version of the poem online. And this could make an interesting object of study. It's at the intersection of Buddhist ideas and European religious sensitivities and language when presenting these ideas. And we could take for just one brief example these opening lines from the poem, which are on the right in the slide. The scripture of the Savior of the world, Lord Buddha, Prince Siddhartha styled on earth, in earth and heavens and hells incomparable, all honored, wisest, best, most pitiful, the teacher of nirvana and the law, then came he to be born again for men. Now, maybe this doesn't sound so foreign or strange, but that's kind of the point. The Christian undertones in Arnold's choice of language are all too evident here. And for a generation or more of readers, the Buddha was here presented as something like the savior of Asian religious history that was presented as something comparable to the savior in Christian tradition. And there is then again the interpretation of Buddhism that saw it through the lens of 19th century mysticism. And this is embodied most clearly in the promotion of Buddhist teaching by the Theosophical Society. Now, although maybe more noteworthy as an American phenomenon, the Theosophical Society and its Russian-born founder, Helena Blavatsky, had no small influence in the UK also. Founded in 1875, the Theosophical Society could be thought of as a new religious movement that married Western fascination with the occult and piecemeal understanding of Asian religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. And the wide readership of publications by Blavatsky and others played an important role in popularizing Buddhism as an alternative to what was often presented here as the rigid and dogmatic religious institutions of European Christianity. And many of the most important figures in the early life of Western Buddhism had some involvement in theosophy, even if their own ideas and writings went on then to depart from this and its mystical character. One of the most important of these figures in Britain was Christmas Humphreys, that is founder of the London Buddhist Society in 1924, whose writings indeed moved steadily from this mystical interpretation of Buddhism in the direction of something a little different again. Now, this different thing, which I'll revisit later in the session, is what is sometimes called Buddhist modernism, a phenomenon not peculiar just to the West, but also to Asian Buddhisms that have evolved in dialogue with colonialism, post-colonialism, and Western scholarship. Forms of Buddhist modernism, to some or other degree, downplay the ritual or supernatural aspect of Buddhist teaching and tradition, and they continue in the vein of the Buddha having been something like an enlightened thinker, that is fundamentally rational, rationalistic. That is, they understand the Buddha to have taught something closer to philosophy. We've encountered already in these sessions an Indian form of Buddhist modernism, that in the writings of B.R. Ambedkar. But Buddhist modernism goes beyond this to claim that what is of importance in the teachings of the Buddha can be best understood in terms that are most familiar to 20th century audiences. So one other aspect of this is Buddhism's prioritization of the mind, for example. And this has been a strong focus in a lot of later Buddhist, Western Buddhist writings. Today, Western traditions of mindfulness practice, although in many cases founded upon principles and practices of modern clinical psychiatry, have drawn a lot from Western engagement with Buddhist meditation. That is both in text and in living Buddhist practice. The aims of contemporary mindfulness are not necessarily the same as those of a practicing Buddhist. So, for example, at a mindfulness center, you're unlikely to discuss your prospects for escaping the cycle of rebirth, or in fact, what's happening to you in a next life. But the influence of Buddhism here is clear and pretty well attested. And then there are also some modern Buddhist authors who eschew the idea that this is best thought of as a religion, let alone a kind of mysticism, but who also think that Buddhism is certainly more than just what it has to offer psychology or psychiatry. And it's to one of the authors involved in this understanding of Buddhism that I'll return a little later.
Apologies there, I can get the toolbar back up to unmute myself. So we've heard then how some of the early encounters with Buddhism came about, but in fact there was a really massive boost in the 60s and 70s onwards. This is a really important moment in the rise in Buddhist traditions in UK. And this was partly to do with cultural changes and the search for new religious movements. We've already heard a little bit about that, and for personal forms of what we often refer to as spiritualities. But it was also partly about global history. So, for example, the exile of Tibetan religious leaders, and also old colonial and Commonwealth networks offering opportunities for travel and exchange. And I often find it's helpful to view British Buddhism as being, in some sense, a snapshot of all of the complexity of different forms of Asian Buddhism, with some extra distinctively Western forms thrown in. So just by way of introduction, there are Theravada forms. For example, both the Samatha Trust, a lay meditation movement of Thai influence, and the Forest Sangha, about which I'll say a little bit more later on, were founded in the 1970s, while Wat Buddha Padipa, which is a traditional Thai temple in the heart of Wimbledon, depicted here on the left of the slide, was built in the 1980s. And then there are East Asian forms of Mahayana Buddhism here too. A Soto Zen monastery was founded in Northumberland in 1972, and Zen and Chan groups, as well as Pure Land groups, can be found across the UK today. Soka Gakkai International, a Buddhist movement formed in Japan in the 1970s with an emphasis on peace building and activism, took over Taplow Court in Buckinghamshire as its UK headquarters in 1988, also depicted on the slide. The community of interbeing, which we mentioned in an earlier session, the engaged Buddhist movement founded by Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Zen monk, is somewhat later in its arrival in the UK, but very important today. And then there are also forms of Tibetan or wider Himalayan Mahayana Buddhism, with the Karma Kagyu lineage establishing a monastery in Scotland in 1967, the Samye Ling monastery depicted here at the bottom of the slide, and the first Tibetan monastery to be founded outside of Asia. And all the other branches of, all the other major branches of Tibetan Buddhism also have a presence in the UK one way or another. And I hope that this little snapshot of selection of images gives you a kind of flavour of how fun it is talking about Buddhism in Britain, because on the one hand we have some purpose-built Buddhist sites that in some ways maintain the architectural traditions of Asian forms of Buddhism, and on the other hand we have a very long-standing tradition of Buddhist groups taking over stately homes and other such buildings, and there is a link in the slide notes to a blog related to a research project that explores Buddhist buildings in the UK and the various ways in which they've been approached. So that can be a helpful teaching resource as well. So we have Theravada, we have East Asian Mahayana, we have Tibetan or Himalayan Mahayana, and then we also have distinctively Western groups, which have a major presence in the UK, most notably the Tri-ratna order, which I'll come to in a moment. So there's a huge number and huge variety of groups in the UK, representing all different forms of Asian Buddhist traditions, as well as offering innovative approaches that suit Western interests and concerns. So it's quite hard to talk about Buddhism in Britain as a single thing. There is a sense that there is a central Buddhist group, which is known as the Network of Buddhist Organisations, and was founded in 1993 with the aim of acting as a spokesperson, particularly in relation to liaising with government and various other policymakers. You can find out more about those in the PowerPoint notes as well. But given this huge range of Buddhist movements and groups in the UK, it's quite difficult to give a comprehensive overview. So what I'm going to do instead is to take two case studies to say a little bit more about. I've selected the two as good examples of established British Buddhist movements, but with different approaches to Asian Buddhist authorities. and both with some history of having to grapple with some of their tensions around their place in UK life. So the first is the Forest Sangha. Now, the Forest Sangha is a worldwide network of Theravada monasteries that are branches of a mother monastery, if you like, in northeast Thailand that was the residence of a particularly charismatic teacher, Ajahn Chah, also known as Cha Subado. And the forest tradition in Thailand emphasizes a more ascetic path of wandering monasticism and meditation practice, as opposed to the more settled, institutionalized monastic life that's very embedded into Thai society. And several Westerners became disciples of Ajahn Chah, and over time the movement spread around the world. The first branch monastery to be founded outside Thailand was, in fact, Chitta Viveka, founded in 1979 at Chithurst House in West Sussex, and you can see that on the slide. And a sister monastery, Amaravati, was established not far from Hemel Hempstead in 1984, and both remain thriving Buddhist centres today, with communities of monks and nuns and a strong lay following. Now, the key player in the establishment of the Forest Sangha in the UK was Ajahn Sumedho, an American-born disciple of Ajahn Chah, and his many writings and teachings have reached a wide audience of Western Buddhists. The emphasis of the tradition, and of Ajahn Sumedho's teachings in particular, is on meditation practice, but also ethical behaviours disciplined by monastic life. Teachings come from the Theravada school, and there is still a close relationship with the Thai mother monastery and the wider Thai forest tradition. So here's a group that is explicitly for Westerners, and that has abbots and other monastic residents often born in the West, but with very strong links to a Thai lineage and an emphasis on orthodox Theravada teachings and practices. And so in lots of ways, this forms a very successful balance, in fact. But at times this combination has caused tension, and this has perhaps been most obvious in discussions around gender equality, particularly in the last couple of years. In the last couple of decades. So essentially the problem arises because, as we've mentioned previously in discussions, in Theravada Buddhism, the lineage of full ordination for nuns died out quite a long time ago. So in other words, although Theravada Buddhists believe that the Buddha ordained women as well as men, the ability of the community to ordain women now has been lost. And this is because you need a certain number of senior nuns in order to ordain the new nuns. And so as the numbers dwindled, and there's a long history of evidence to suggest that nuns' communities received less resource, less support than the monks, eventually there were too few senior nuns left to ordain more, and the lineage died out. And traditionally, only a Buddha can revive it. And the question over whether or not the full ordination for nuns should be restarted has been really important to modern global Buddhist networks. And it's worth noting that the nuns' lineage for other branches of Buddhism didn't die out. So an attempt was made in the 1990s to restart the Theravada lineage with the oversight of nuns from Taiwan, but the legitimacy of this has been challenged by more orthodox monastic voices, particularly those in Thailand. Now, the Forest Sangha initially took a relatively normal approach to this problem within Theravada communities, namely offering women a different form of ordination. In this case, the women become Siladharas by taking on 10 precepts instead of the many hundreds of rules that govern full ordination. And although Forest Sangha statements throughout the debates over this emphasised the equal value of the woman's path, the monastic code, which of course is believed to originate with the Buddha himself, makes clear that even the most senior nun is inferior to the most junior monk. And this manifests in rules around who bows to whom, who oversees ritual and teaching occasions, who eats first, and so on. So the Forest Sangha has tended to insist that this can't be changed, that women cannot necessarily take the same status as men. When a senior Forest Sangha teacher in Australia, Ajahn Brahm, ordained 4 nuns in 2009, the result was excommunication from the Forest Sangha tradition. He's since been part of a project to establish a community of fully ordained Theravada nuns in the UK. So you'll notice that the key concern here is about authenticity. Because of a clear commitment not to change, not to innovate, particularly in the realm of monastic regulations believed to have been laid down by the Buddha himself, the community inevitably ended up with their ordained women appearing inferior to their ordained men in a way that didn't sit well in British society. And the solutions often involved simply separating out the monks and nuns so that issues of ritual seniority and hierarchy were just less visible. Meanwhile, other Buddhists have been equally adamant that the Buddha himself wanted women to become fully ordained nuns, and that this should be taken as overriding the legalistic restrictions that have come about during the history of the order. So both parties are sure that they are doing what the Buddha wanted. But then there's the added complication of the tension between the relatively orthodox Thai monastic setting and the liberal Western insistence on full gender equality. Who gets to decide what the Buddha really meant? And the tension over who speaks for the Buddha now is evident in other groups as well, including those that are wholly established by Westerners. And perhaps the best example of a fully Western Buddhist tradition is the Tri-ratna movement, which used to be known as the FWBO, stood for Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. Tri-ratna was founded by a British man, Dennis Lingwood, who was born in 1925 and travelled extensively in Asia, first as a member of the armed forces and later seeking teachings from a range of Buddhist teachers. In 1949, he was ordained into the Theravada lineage, and his ordination meant that he took the name Sangha, the name by which he was then known until his death in 2018. So although he was a Theravada monk, Sangha was actually ordained in India, and he studied also with Tibetan teachers and even Chan Buddhist masters. And he was involved in movements that sought to bridge boundaries between Buddhist lineages in Asia. And in 1967, Sangha returned to England and founded the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. And one distinctive feature of the movement is that there's a breaking down of the boundaries between monastic and lay practice. And there's also a combination of different forms of Asian Buddhism. And both of these, of course, reflect Sangha own experiences of bringing together Theravada and Mahayana teachings, and also of combining Theravada monastic discipline with an appreciation for a more engaged and less rigidly monastic practice. So full members of the order remain living in society, and they're not expected to be celibate, but they do take on a Buddhist name and certain precepts. And then practices and doctrinal commitments combine Theravada and Mahayana strands, all in forms made deliberately accessible to Westerners. For example, Tri-ratna teachings about the realms of rebirth tend to emphasize the possibility of viewing them as psychological states, experienced in our current and potentially only lifetime. And so this can make the idea of the cycle of rebirth and re-death, which is generally taken for granted in Asian Buddhism, more palatable to Westerners. So in Tri-ratna, we have a fully Western form of Buddhism, drawing on a range of Asian traditions and based on the understanding and teachings of a British man who explicitly sought to make Buddhism successful in the UK. And it is indeed hugely successful as a movement with now an international following, but it has also had to deal with problems. Sangha was accused of abusing his position of power by having sexual relations with young male followers in the 1970s and 80s, and the movement has had to take steps to address this and to re-envision their relationship with the founder. The rebrand as Tri-ratna in 2010 is viewed by many as an attempt to move into a new era, and it also takes account of the fact that this supposedly Western Buddhist order now has actually a lot of followers in India. And it's worth noting that several other Buddhist groups in the West have had to grapple with similar issues. Buddhist traditions in the West often revolve around a single charismatic teacher, and this does come with risks similar to those experienced in other religious groups. Like other Buddhist teachers, Sangha framed his teachings as being authentically Buddhist, returning to the root of what the Buddha himself taught, cutting back through layers of what he viewed as misinterpretations and cultural accretions. The new name of the group, Tri-ratna, really emphasizes this focus on perceived authenticity. Tri-ratna, of course, means 3 jewels and refers to the Buddha, his Dharma, or his teaching, and the Sangha, or Buddhist community, also known as the 3 refuges. These 3 have been at the heart of Buddhist identity since the very beginning of the tradition. So who is the Buddha for Tri-ratna members? What does it mean to take refuge in him? Their statement on their website tells us that the Buddha is seen as a refuge, not because he will help us to escape life and its difficulties, but because his example and teaching represent practical and reliable responses to our sorrows in the face of life. They can help free us from attachment to false refuges, those mundane things we look to for happiness and security, but which are ultimately incapable of providing them. The Buddha's vision and example are fundamental. So even in the most westernized form of Buddhism in Britain, the Buddha remains at the heart. And, of course, his image is found in Tri-ratna centres all over the UK, such as here in the Manchester Buddhist Centre.
So what else do we have in the way of Western or very modern understandings of the Buddha? of the kind that we find in Tri-ratna. So this takes us back to a distinction that I made earlier on between Buddhist adherents, and surely Tri-ratna members are Buddhist adherents to some extent, by anyone's definition. And then this idea of Buddhist sympathizers, the latter of whom may still have an interest in the Buddha and his teachings, but without wanting to commit themselves to an organization that we might say does Buddhist things in any way. And as we wind up this series, let's think again about a distinction, another distinction or tension that we recognized at the very beginning. That is between the historical figure Siddhartha Gautama, who was surely a living, breathing founder of what we think of as Buddhism, and then the Buddha of tradition, who's certainly much more than any historical figure, whom to Buddhists, as far back as we know, was the most recent fully awakened teacher to emerge in the world. Even if scholars are unsure how far we can know this historical figure, proponents of Buddhism continue to make their case for who this figure was. And they draw upon not only the vast number of stories and sayings attributed to the Buddha, but also on their own cultural context when they affirm what they take Buddhism and the Buddha to really be about. And we've seen this already a little bit with Sangha and Tri-ratna. In fact, we've seen a few examples of how the Buddha has been seemingly reimagined throughout the history of Buddhism. So, for example, as a fully transcendent being in some forms of Mahayana Buddhism, and then more recently as something like a social reformer, as one finds in modern Ambedkar or Navayana Buddhism in India. And we refer you back to our earlier sessions in the series for more on these examples. We've also tried to keep in mind that our oldest surviving Buddhist materials, and the Theravada tradition that preserves some of these, are not lacking in reverence for the Buddha. They certainly understand him to be more than just a man. For Theravada Buddhists, the Buddha possesses great supernatural power as well as knowledge. He surpasses all of the gods. And his reintroduction of the Dharma into the world is perpetuating this cycle of awakened beings who transform the world one at a time from a state of ignorance to one that has in it some hope of liberation. Now, today there are a great many Western Buddhists, and we might say here also Buddhist sympathizers, if they don't consider themselves to be Buddhist per se, who consider the Buddha in thoroughly modern terms, indeed as something like a philosopher, something as like a psychologist, or at any rate a teacher who's nothing like what they consider to be the accretions or corruptions of Buddhism that they would find in different Asian cultures or in certain texts. Now, if you visit your local bookshop, and if it has a section on Buddhism, you might be unlikely to find some of the kinds of books that Naomi and I use with our students. But you will find the no less stimulating work of figures like Thich Nhat Hanh, who we've heard mentioned again today. That is the great popularizer of engaged Buddhism. Or you might find things written by the Dalai Lama. Or you might find some of the very widely read and best-selling works by Stephen Batchelor. Now, Batchelor is just one very successful exponent of a thoroughly modern, a thoroughly Western conceptualization of the Buddha and his teachings. And this in a fashion that's acquired a lot of popularity in Britain and elsewhere. Batchelor was born in Scotland in the early 1950s, and after a time living in North India, was ordained and trained in both the Tibetan and Zen traditions, specifically South Korean Zen. After over a decade as a monastic, he disrobed and began writing about and teaching his interpretation of the Dharma to a general public. And he's published a great many books on what has come to be called, among other names, secular Buddhism. Batchelor's first major publication, which is still probably the most celebrated of his works and not uncontroversial, is his Buddhism Without Beliefs, first published in 1997. And in this and elsewhere, Batchelor exposits secular Buddhism as an interpretation of Buddhism that holds that in its true character, this should not be confused at all for anything like a religion, nor should the Buddha be thought of as a teacher of something that should be considered religious at all. And this is now a not uncommon view among students of Buddhism, that whatever this thing is, it doesn't deserve to be called a religion, regardless of the many features of it that have led to Buddhism being characterized as just that. And we're not here to debate that particular issue, or at least not until we get into the Q&A. That is the matter of how we define a religion and whether or not Buddhism meets the requisite criteria to be considered a religion. But what we can look at here is what Batchelor says about the Buddha. And we can consider this in relation to what we've seen at Asian imaginings of the Buddha down the centuries. On this slide are a couple of good sound bites from Batchelor, with which I think a lot of Western Buddhists or Buddhist sympathizers might agree. The Buddha was not a mystic. His awakening was not a shattering insight into a transcendent truth that revealed to him the mysteries of God. He did not claim to have had an experience that granted him privileged esoteric knowledge of how the universe ticks. Only as Buddhism became more and more of a religion were such grandiose claims imputed to his awakening. And then Batchelor goes on pages later. Historically, Buddhism has tended to lose its agnostic dimension through becoming institutionalized as a religion. And he gives us his definition here. That is a revealed belief system, valid for all time, controlled by an elite body of priests. Now, I fully agree that the Buddha is not best thought of as a mystic, but perhaps for a reason slightly different to Batchelor's. So valid as all of his statements may be, let's remember that the category mystic, so also the category religion and agnostic, and indeed the very notion of God that's intended here, these are concepts drawn from Western religious or wider intellectual cultural circles. And these things are brought to Buddhism as part of Western scholarship and culture trying to make sense of what this thing is. One thing we've tried to stress in this series is that although the Buddha can be thought of in different ways, so as a teacher, philosopher, as a social reformer, as a divinity, or as something else, the Buddha is first and foremost an exemplar of a separate, very ancient category that has no direct equivalent in the West. That is, he is, in a word, a Buddha. Batchelor's statement that the Buddha's awakening was not a revelation about the mysteries of God is fair enough. But do we know that the Buddha did not claim to have had an awareness into how the universe ticks, as Batchelor writes here? Well, this depends on what we mean by the universe. In our only early sources for the Buddha and his teaching, and these are of course Buddhist sources, the Buddha is awakened to nothing less than how transmigration, or what earlier on I called the human condition, as understood in ancient India, how that really works. And the Buddha is awakened to not just how this works in the present life, but fundamentally how this operates across successive lifetimes. Batchelor's agnosticism here refers to a lack of opinion on big metaphysical questions. And indeed, we've seen some of this in some Buddhist sources or something like it. For example, when the Buddha refuses to answer questions about things like the beginning of the cosmos or its extent or things like this. But importantly, these same ancient and classical Buddhist sources report the Buddha accepting the influence of gods and the mechanics of karma and of merit making. And the Buddha talks about this cosmic cycle of Buddhas coming into and leaving the world and so on. And the thing is, we don't know Buddhism before it featured any of these ideas. And it's a bit of a leap to say that it ever did exist before or without them in the way that an author like Batchelor presents it. Undoubtedly, Batchelor is writing for a Western audience that he believes has something to learn from Buddhism. For him, the Dharma is concerned with, he writes, existential experience, and I wouldn't doubt this at all. But presenting Buddhism as a tradition that concerns existential matters, without conceptualizing this in terms of rebirth and liberation, and without gods and spirits, and without this model of awakened beings, this is to take selectively from Buddhist teachings those things that are most appealing to Western audiences. And I also want to stress that I don't think there's anything wrong with this kind of fresh interpretation of the Buddha and his Dharma. And I also think there's nothing particularly new in it either. Buddhists, as we've tried to address in this series, Buddhism has been something like a transcultural phenomenon. It's something, whether we call it a religion or not, that centuries ago made its way from India across Central Asia into China and into Southeast Asia, and then further east. And every time it evolved in accord with what its message had that most appealed to new audiences. So forms of modern Buddhism, or Batchelor's secular Buddhism, that strip Buddhist teaching to something that most satisfies contemporary Western mindsets and culture could be said to be just another turning of the wheel of Dharma in another setting again. Where Batchelor departs from what we as scholars might say is where he writes elsewhere that his conception of a secular Dharma constitutes, and I'm quoting him here, a return to the roots of the tradition. He writes that this must rethink and articulate the Dharma anew. Rethinking and re-articulating the Dharma anew. Well, sure. And this is perfectly in alignment with Buddhist history. But returning to the roots of the tradition, well, this is also fine. But fine insofar as this is what many Buddhist traditions across the world and down the centuries have consistently understood themselves to be doing. And on every occasion, they arrive at something slightly different. And this is usually clearly also a response to the context and needs of a new audience. So the Buddha, in short, is a figure who through history has been reinvented in different eras and different places. And having him speak anew for 21st century Britain is something by which we really shouldn't really be surprised.
So we can see that this final session in the series really adds to what we've seen already in earlier sessions, that the Buddha means so many different things to different people, to different groups in modern Britain, as also across Asia. And one neat way to reinforce this in the classroom could be to use images as starting points for discussion. And one of the things we've tried to do in this series is provide you with a lot of images in the PowerPoint files that you might want to use in your teaching. And as we've already seen, images of the Buddha are everywhere and open up important questions such as, does the Buddha in a supermarket mean the same as in a Thai restaurant or in one of the many Buddhist centres or temples that dot the landscape these days? What matters most? What the image depicts? What the creators intended? The context in which the image is used? Why, in any case, are Buddha images so popular? Questions like this are really good ways into a classroom conversation, a conversation which might then move on to explorations of different views of the Buddha more widely. And it isn't just images of the Buddha himself that we find around the UK. Increasingly, stupas or pagodas are becoming part of the landscape too, and these can also help to summarise the state of Buddhism in the UK. So I'm just going to say a few words about these before we close today. So as you may remember from session 4, I think it was, stupas are reliquaries and objects of worship that are understood to be the Buddha in some sense. They can enshrine bodily relics or images of the Buddha, or even texts. And these three on the slide are all examples from the UK. For although they are far less common than in Asia, there are still quite a few around and growing all the time. So sometimes stupas are there as part of a Buddhist centre of practice and community, such as the large white stupa here on the left that is part of the Samye Ling monastery in Dumfriesshire. So as I mentioned earlier, this monastery was the first Tibetan monastery outside of Asia, dating back to 1967, and it remains a very important Tibetan community, Buddhist community in Scotland, and indeed very important in the UK more broadly. And the stupa is a slightly later addition. It was built in 2000, and it functions very much as a stupa would at a Tibetan monastic centre, even if it is, in fact, nestled into a Scottish landscape. A slightly more complicated stupa setting is the one in the centre of the slide, which is in the Himalayan gardens of Harewood House, a stately home near Leeds. It was commissioned in 2004 by the Earl of Harewood, who has long been interested in Buddhism and also struggling with the colonial past of his family seat and the responsibilities that that brings. So he brought a group of Bhutanese monks over to build the stupa in the gardens as an attempt, he said, to bring harmony to the site. So there's a link in the PowerPoint notes to a talk he gave about this, and indeed he's written a book about it too if you want to know more. And one of the things he's keen to emphasise is that this is an authentic stupa. Again, this word authentic. It may be built of Yorkshire stone by local builders, but it was overseen by Bhutanese designers, and its nested chambers contain relics in the form of statues and even some bone fragments. And the stupa is used by Buddhist devotees, but it's also enjoyed by other visitors to the house and gardens of this stately home. And notice that the Earl of Harewood intends the stupa to bring harmony to a site he knows that has been coloured by the darkest deeds of colonialism. As is also the case for Buddha images, stupas are strongly associated with peace, and this explains their rising presence outside of Buddhist centres. So take, for example, the other image on the slide, which some of you may recognise as the Peace Pagoda in Battersea Park in London. And this pagoda was built in the mid-1980s as part of a bigger project by a Japanese Buddhist master and his followers who form a branch of the Nichiren school of Buddhism. who sought to build pagodas worldwide as symbols of peace and an encouragement to resist war. And this movement began following the use of the atomic bomb in Japan at the end of the Second World War. And indeed, two of the earliest peace pagodas were constructed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this London pagoda has images of the Buddha in different key moments from his life, and is used as a focal point for peace marches and other activism, as well as a site for Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike. So you can see from this image, it's got the scene on the Buddha's deathbed, but as you go around, there are different scenes you can see. So stupas or pagodas as symbols of peace, often including images of the Buddha, as you can see, are still being installed all over the UK by other Buddhist movements. One recently appeared in the Edinburgh Botanic Gardens, for example, and there's almost certainly one near you. So enabling pupils to visit it and discuss its implications could be a rich way to enter into a better understanding of both the place of Buddhism in Britain and also the place of British Buddhism in a global tradition. So this small selection of stupas joins our earlier explorations of Buddha images and Buddhist centres and Buddhist teachers and writers, even those who might not straightforwardly describe themselves as Buddhist. And we hope that this overall demonstrates that Buddhism in Britain is as diverse as Asian Buddhism, with the added complication of being a tradition that is not culturally native and hence has had to find ways to appeal to new audiences. And during the last few centuries, Buddhism has become a really important part of British culture in terms of rising numbers of formal groups of practitioners, but also in its wider impact on landscape, language, literature, and culture.